Very good
And
morning, madam.
good morning, sir. Good morning. Today's topic or today's theme that I have chosen is looking at the challenges in socio-economic history narratives. Now, this theme itself becomes very relevant. This theme is considered as crucial and to be taken up for discussion, primarily because the entire methodology of studying socio-economic history, the entire approach towards history in general, as well as the entire approach towards studying socio-economic history has drastically altered, has faced a paradigm shift from around 20th century. Which means that there is a very big challenge to the epistemology of history itself. And this challenge is arising from the emphasis shifting in history. The emphasis has now shifted from event to that of process. Meaning, for a very long time, history was always considered as a very large record, a very large document of what all happened in the past. So that meant whether it was a famine or whether it was a drought, whether it was natural phenomena or natural causes like droughts or famines or floods or epidemics or earthquakes, like the way it happened in Pompeii, in Greece. So whether it was natural calamities or whether it was man-made activities or human-initiated actions. So that could be wars or signing of treaties or signing of agreements, or it could be establishment of governing institutions or governing policies, administrative policies. So anything that human or community or society initiated activities, all of these were combined to form a historical narrative. So for a very long time, the traditional approach to history was the what aspect. Traditional approach studied whatever happened in the past. So what was happening in the past? Events were very important, and that was considered as a very big part of the historical documentation. However, from around the midpoint of 20th century, the early 20th century onwards, a gradual transition occurred where the emphasis shifted from the what part of history to the why part of history. Meaning, historians as well as scholars of history or students of history were now no longer interested, or they were now no longer focused on the what part. Whatever had happened in the past had happened. But the emphasis now was the urge to explore was why did those things happen? In the sense, what exactly was the processes that were involved. So the emphasis was not on event, the emphasis now was on the process of change that had emerged. So the why part of history became crucial. The why part of history became a principal focus of attention of historians, scholars of history, students of history, etc. So as a result, there is a change in the approach and there is a change in the content that history passes off, or in the content that historical narratives have been using. So though at a lower level, we look at history, looks at events. For the beginners, it is a collection of events that have happened or that have occurred. At a slightly elevated level, historical knowledge, the epistemology of history is not just the event or the what part, it is the why part that is dominated by various theories, schools, and philosophies. Okay, so at a higher level, historians and students of history are no longer studying the what part of history. What did this king do, or what did that queen do? What was the kind of administration? What was the taxation system? Now, these are considered as already studied, as a given. So, at a higher level, The question or the exploration is, why exactly, through what theories can this taxation system be understood? Or through what schools of history can the activities be understood? Through what philosophies, by applying what theories, by using what schools of history, can a particular stage or phase of history can be understood? So the primary challenges in socio-economic history narratives that any historian or student of history faces is to understand the socio-economic history of a period, not through several activities or actions, but understand history through theories, through schools, and through philosophy. So that is a very, very big challenge. The challenge is also, it is considered as a challenge because while socio-economic history is territory specific, is area specific, the theories that exist, the schools that exist are universal in nature. First of all, they are Eurocentric in nature. All of these theories have arisen from the European cultural context, from the European intellectual traditions, intellectual history, and that is being applied, that is being used to understand the socio-economic histories of various parts of the world. It could be India, or it could be Africa, or it could be any other, the Maoris of Australia, etc. So I'm looking at these challenges that exist in studying the socio-economic history by looking at three important philosophies, schools, and theories. So I'm using them to literally challenge the notion of history itself, to literally understand how they have challenged the foundations of history. And from there, we will have to branch out to socio-economic history. So the annals is primarily a school of history. Deconstruction is a theory of history. Postmodernism is one of the philosophies or one of the ideological sharings of history. So using these three, I am going to argue out as to how there are several challenges into the understanding of history in general and socio-economic history also in a specific component. Now, let us look at the Annals. The Annals School of History was one of the first post-Marxian school to emerge. A number of historians, they were very happy and they were very proud to be a part of the Annals School, because the Annals School was one of the first radical school, or I would say one of the first very different schools of history to emerge after the Marxist period and after the Marxian dialectics. So that is why having anything different from the Marxist approach in construction of historical knowledge is something that the annals were very proud of. Now, this school of history arose in France, and it started out between the two World War periods. 1918 was the end of the First World War. 39 was the beginning of the Second World War. So in between the war period was the beginning of the Annals School of History. So this Annals School, it had three different stages or three different phases. 29 was one phase, and then till the Second World War got over, the Annals School work continued in the first phase itself. Then from 1940s, the post-war period, from 40s, 49 onwards, the second stage of annals studies began. And then from 1960s onwards, with Robert Munro, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, and others, the third phase of annals began. Okay, now having said that, let us look at what exactly were the annals talking about that questioned or that brought about a very deep transition in the way history as a knowledge system was being constructed. Now, the early annals, that is 1929, was the period of Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre, and they are called as the early annals historians. So these early annals, one of the very important stand taken by Marc Bloch and Lucien Febvre was their revolt against the 19th century historiographical tradition. Now, till 19th century, The general idea was that if history is written in an empirical manner, and what is empirical? Empirical is driven by fact, driven by statistics, driven by quantitative method, driven by numbers. So, till around 19th century, traditional historians believed that numbers, factual data, statistical data, have the capacity to capture history in an objective manner. It is because of this tradition, okay, the 19th century historiographical tradition, that history writing is dominated by numbers even till today. So much so, if we talk to any of the history students, they say it's very boring because there are more and more of numbers, more and more of dates, more and more of periods. So constantly history writing is dominated by breaking up of dates and periods and centuries into smaller and smaller components. So the general idea of behind this was use these numbers or use these statistical data, then history writing and understanding will become very neutral, unbiased. It does not become prejudicial. And then the 19th century historiographical tradition also said that there is a certain specificity, as in history means it has a certain border, it has a certain feature. It cannot assimilate with other disciplines or other domains. So that is why even today our students have an idea. They believe, not an idea, they believe that history is different from political science, which is different from physics, or something is different from economics. What they do not understand is all of these are interrelated systems, interrelated knowledge systems, and they are a part of all of these narratives. So there was a disruption. So the general idea was that history was intellectually isolated from other disciplines. They stated that the students believe that each one of our disciplines are an island by themselves and there is no connection between these two. So that tradition of believing that each discipline exists in isolation of the other was something that the 19th century historians or historiographical tradition had encouraged. Now, it was these traditions that the Annal School of Historians very strongly rejected or very strongly opposed and said historical studies cannot be just a moment. Yeah. Historical studies cannot be done or cannot be brought in through this kind of segregation or this kind of boxing. It was Hugh Trevor Roper, one of the early historians of 20th century. He identifies three important features of the Annal School, and he says the Annal School historians were not interested in picking out minute parts. Like, for example, what is minute parts? Today, we are very familiar with the way PhD studies happen, and most of us are looking into the minutest part of a theme. So we are not trying to do a research on history of Karnataka. Rather, we are breaking it down to the smallest component. So either it is the economic history of Karnataka, not even economic history of Karnataka, economic history of the princely Mysore state in relation to just two districts or three districts. Or we don't do history of South India, but history of maybe Telangana or Rayalaseema. So there is a certain limitation, or there is a certain restriction, or merging history into the smallest denomination. This was something that the annals opposed and said history should be studied in totality. It should be studied in a major way. And the Trevor Roper also says that the Annal School of Historians, they believe that there is a deterministic force that controls the movement of history. No amount of causes to understand an event will definitely prove beyond doubt. For example, if one says these are the causes for Second World War, no historian, scholar, or student is able to prove with evidence and without any hesitation that these are the only causes. Nothing else brought in the war. We can't prove that. We only say probably these were the causes that caused that war. So Trevor Roper argued that the annals historians constantly, they look into, they believe that there is a deterministic force that drives history, which is beyond the perception of human argument or human logic. And thus, the annals historians, they have a very intricate web of method, theory, philosophy, etc. One of the important contribution of the annal school was that, specifically in relation to socio-economic history, was that they argued, and this was their major contribution, they argued that politics was less than central to historical understanding, because for the 19th century or till 19th century historiographical tradition, which has continued even till today, for all of us, politics is the core part of history. So all of our argument and understanding starts with, if it is ancient period, we go back to what the monarch did or what the dynasties did. If it is medieval and modern period, we come to the colonial period, or we come to what the state does. So constantly history was looking at a lens. Historians were looking at the past through the lens of only politics, which Mark Bloch and Lucien Febvre very, very strongly questioned and said, human life and human society is so diverse that politics occupies a very small component of the entire initiative or entire thought process itself. There is society, there is economy, there is art, literature, philosophy, religion, so many diverse aspects to a society, and hence politics should not be the core part of writing history. And they also questioned, the annals questioned the whole idea of trying to analyze the past by looking at certain facts and say, this is what happened in the past. So we look at the war and say, Tipu Sultan. So what was Tipu Sultan's contribution? The war that he fought. We do not look at the scientific contribution that Tipu Sultan brought in, or we do not look at similarly so many other diverse contribution. So the annals historians, they argued that events are only specific examples of how societies thought, what was their belief system. So politics or events are just examples of the belief systems, examples of the thought processes that people in ancient period or people in the past thought. They do not represent the essential feature of the past. They do not represent the essence. Actions represent, or actions are an example of only particular part of the past. So what did they do? They said, since politics is less than central, and since events are just passing examples of what the societies thought, etc., they argued that the method for constructing history, the method for bringing out the historical narrative also should drastically change with a change in approach. New theories and methods have to be brought in order to construct history in a much more holistic manner, in a much more comprehensive manner. So what did they do? They argued that a historian or a student of history should move away from the kind of sources that a government, a state, or a power or an authority creates. Instead, a historian must start using all those documentation that are there or that are present or prevalent in non-political institutions. For example, when the government passes an order or the government adopts a bill in the parliament, it immediately, the details of the bill, the details of the law immediately gets recorded in the National Archives or the State Archives. So the government makes sure that all of its works are documented in the archives. Whereas, so that was an accepted method or accepted agency for historians to write history based on the archival record. Whereas the annals historians, whether it was Mark Bloch or Lucien Febvre, and later Robert Munro, Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, all of them, they said alternative documents or documents available in alternative spaces must also be considered as sources for historical narrative. For example, they said the documents that are prevalent in courts, whether it is the lower court or Supreme Court, documents prevalent in courts, and documents that are maintained by temples, by monasteries, by seminaries, by mathas, or by churches, or by the idgas or madras. These also should be used because these are documents that are maintained not because they are interested in continuing their image or in justifying their image. These are documents that are maintained primarily because they need them to function. So how much of money was collected by the Matha or by the church last year? They have a document and then they try and either increase or decrease. So they are maintaining documents for their own operational necessities. But for a historian, it can become a major source or a major channel of communication. So all of these became the annals historians' argument was that historical construction cannot be through political history, cannot be through state-induced sources. It has to be through several other sources. So the challenge for constructing a socio-economic history is to come up with or is to look at a lot of alternative data that exists. The data can be records in a monastery. The data can also be old newspapers that exist in a newspaper office. The data can also be palm leaf records that exist in a seminary, etc. Or the data can be the number of visitors who have visited that library. So all of these can be data a historian needs to. The challenge is to train himself or herself to extract history from this kind of data because they are not straightforward. A state a state issued data is very straightforward. It says the government introduced this bill on such and such a day, on such and such a period, and these were the issues. So it's a very straightforward document. Whereas the sources that are there in non-state, issued by non-state actors, are all indirect in nature. They keep on mentioning what happened in that period. For 50 years, what was the kind of people who visited that monastery? Or what was the kind of crops that were grown in the lands belonging to that institution, okay, to that Devalaya. So a historian should, the challenge is to train themselves to extract the socio-economic historical details from such data that is present. So that is from the schools that are there. Then, as one goes by, am I audible? And
audible, madam.
Okay.
Audible, madam.
Okay, thank you. So the next one that we are using is deconstruction. So from schools, we have now come to a theory called as deconstruction theory. This also arose in 19th and 20th century. It was the chief contributors to this deconstruction theory was Hayden White, Michel Foucault, but Jacques Derrida becomes the most vociferous voice in deconstruction theory. Now, what did the deconstructionist or deconstruction theory talk about? The deconstructionists, they looked at how historical knowledge was being framed or designed in the past. Just as I request participants not to use the slides to write on the slides, please. Okay. Now, one of the issues here was that the Annals School of Historians, they looked at 19th century historians and said whatever 19th century historians were talking or arguing was very problematic. Similarly, the deconstructionist historians, also 19th and 20th century deconstructionist historians, they looked at the Enlightenment movement or Enlightenment era and problematized that Enlightenment era. Now, what exactly was all the Enlightenment era? What was it all about? Enlightenment was a massive movement that arose in the European continent in 18th and 19th centuries. Now, this Enlightenment movement, the main agenda, the main focal point of Enlightenment was to move away from religion-dominated belief system into science-dominated, logic, evidence-dominated knowledge system. So Enlightenment movement constantly argued that knowledge systems cannot be dominated by the belief in God, belief in religion, belief in culture, etc. Rather, Enlightenment said knowledge systems have to be dominated primarily by using science, by using logic and rational thought. And these Enlightenment scholars, they argued that constructing a stable knowledge system is possible, constructing a neutral knowledge system is possible by constructing a very unbiased knowledge system is possible by using a neutral, passive, and stable language. Okay, where one avoids adjectives. For example, all of us constantly are familiar with the idea that Ashoka, we don't even call him as Ashoka Maurya, we always call him as Ashoka the Great. Okay, we always call him as Ashoka the Great. So we are, by using an adjective like the Great, we are already committed to the idea that he is great. That kind of usage is neither passive language and it is not neutral language. Already the bias has come in where we believe that Ashoka was literally a very great monarch, and so there is no way of contesting that belief. So what the Enlightenment historians continuously argued was that use neutral, passive, stable system of language so that it becomes possible to understand, it becomes possible to construct history in an objective and neutral manner. Now, this is beyond, literally, when one looks at the whole idea, it is beyond the argument of what is right, what is wrong, etc. It is also beyond understanding the realities. Okay, it is understanding what exists in the material world of appearances and sensual data. As in appearances, we always use language in a very flexible manner. So the world has got certain appearance. The world has got certain sensual. Sense organs are the eye, the ear, and the tongue, etc. So what the deconstructionists argued was that by using, the Enlightenment historians argued that by using a neutral, stable, passive language, it is possible to understand the reality. It is possible to reach the truth. It is possible to extract the truth. Now, this was what the Enlightenment historians believed. However, the deconstructionist historians, they disputed this exact understanding or exact debate of the Enlightenment historians and argued that the power of the language to represent the world accurately is simply a mirage. It is simply a belief. It does not exactly exist. The argument of the deconstructionist historians was that language does not have the capacity, language does not have the power to constantly represent the world in a very accurate manner. Okay, it can't happen. Rather, for example, F.R. Ankersmith, he says that because language cannot represent the world accurately, why can't language represent the world accurately? Because a language is a social construct. The deconstructionists argued that language is not natural, like tree or ocean or mountain. These are all natural because they come along with nature. Whereas language is something invented by the society. It is a social construct. So society starts investing meaning into the word. For example, this laptop has never told us that its name is laptop. We are the ones who have given a word called as laptop to this machine. Okay, so that means tomorrow, if we decide to change the meaning, then it is no longer laptop, it becomes something else. So, because language is a social construct, the deconstructionist argument said that language cannot represent the world accurately. So, if language cannot represent the world accurately, then history, which uses language to talk about the past, there is no other way that history can be represented. It is only through language. So, Anchor Smith, a deconstructionist historian, argues that there is nothing absolutely truth in history. All the meanings that exist in history are in relation to something else. I'll give a very simple example. For instance, we believe that ancient India was very wealthy. Okay, ancient India was very wealthy. The economic condition of the Guptas was very prosperous, and it was called as Golden Age. Now it is not; it's no longer used. It was very prosperous. Now, how do we understand that prosperity in relation to another period which did not have the same kind of benefits that the Gupta period had? Or, for example, if one says that America is a very prosperous country, how do we understand that? In relation to Asia, Americans are wealthy. So there is always a comparative mode. There is no original meaning, is what Anchor Smith argues. If one says America is a very wealthy nation, even to understand that, we immediately, in our mind, we start comparing what all the Americans have, what kind of cities they have built, what kind of cities we have, what kind of infrastructure we have in comparison to what they have. And then we say, agree that yes, America is very wealthy. So Anchor Smith's argument is nothing in historical interpretation has any original meaning. It is the meaning is always existing in relation to something else. Vijayanagar Empire was very powerful. That statement is in comparison to other kingdoms which did not have the same size of army, for example, that the Vijayanagar Empire had. So, Anchor Smith's argument is that there are no original meaning in history. There is only meaning exists only in the kind of language that is used. Immense prosperity. In order to communicate the idea that it was very prosperous, we say immense prosperity. So we use language to communicate the historical idea, whereas there is nothing original that exists in the historical meaning. Now, this was what Anchor Smith argued. So the argument of deconstructionist historians was that as a result of this, as a result of belief that language is a social construct, that there is no original meaning, everything is relative, everything is understood in relation to something else. Because of this approach, the traditional difference that existed between language and reality no longer exists. We believe, what is this traditional distinction? We believe that there is a powerful, neutral, stable language. All we need to do is use that neutral language to understand the reality. So we believe that reality and language are two different things, whereas deconstructionists argue that language and reality are not different, because language cannot capture reality, and reality is that language is a social construct, and hence it cannot capture reality as it is. So deconstructionists said language cannot be a mirror of the past, as in it cannot be used to represent the past in its exactitude. So the deconstructionist historians, DHs, deconstructionist historians, they constantly thought about language, that is written history, reality, stable and neutral past. Constantly they assimilated, they mixed this in order to argue about history itself. Okay, so much so, the deconstructionist historians, they said historians, all historians, whether they are from America, from West, or from Asia, they have a main objective, and that is to achieve, to know the truth that happened in the past. And deconstructionist historians said it is always a failure because their attempt to know the truth about the past is through language, and language is relative. What is relative? For example, look at a word like violence. Now, when one says, if I use a word like violence, or if we say hunger, now what does hunger communicate? Hunger means several things to several people. It is not the same. For someone who is in the lowest order, for someone who is in the world where needs are more important, so for that individual, hunger is the lack of basic food item. Okay, whereas for someone who comes from a slightly elevated status in society, hunger could be the absence of breakfast. And because they are slightly more elite, they are much more well provided. So for them, the word hunger communicates a different meaning. So is the case with violence. I'm just giving random examples. What is violent? Abusing someone, verbal abuse, killing someone is violent in the present day world. But in 14th and 15th century Europe, they resolved their fight by killing each other. So for them, violence was not killing, violence was something else. So constantly, the whole idea of the traditional historians, the belief of the traditional historians that they can go back, there is a truth that happened in the past. All that they need to do is use correct language, and so they can bring back that truth or bring that past, is simply a mirage. It is just a belief. It does not happen in reality. This is what the deconstructionist historians are constantly arguing. Okay, now this becomes important to history, as I said earlier also, because history is constructed, can be constructed only through language, because whatever has happened in the past has already happened. We can't witness it, which is not the case, for example, for a botanist. Now, a botany student, if he or she wants to study the tree, he can go and pluck the leaf. Let us say he wants to study something about the chlorophyll content in a leaf. He can go pluck a leaf, bring it to the lab and study it. Whereas a historian cannot go back to the past, stage a war and try and understand it. So how does a historian know about the past? Only through language. Language is used by a historian in order to construct the past, social, economic, and the challenge thrown by the deconstructionist historian is that that language is not accurate or absolute at all. Okay, why? Because it is relative. It is a point of reference. Okay, there are several historians, several philosophers. For example, Martin Heidegger, he says a language can be used to separate and correspond, to separate the word and the world. Meaning, the world is different. The way the world gets understood is also very, very different. And Kant was someone who literally hit the nail on the head. Immanuel Kant, he says, why is language a problem? Because every reader is possessed with a certain cultural competence, and that reader understands that text from the cultural context in which she or he is reading a book or is understanding a point. For example, as I said, Violence against women. For example, if someone is reading about, is understanding sati in 16th century, they never considered sati as violent because culture said that sati was a justifiable act. But the same reading about sati in the present day culture, which is completely different. Now we understand sati as a very violent habit, okay, as a very violent practice. So there is a certain cultural training or cultural ingraining of culture within a reader. So a reader, whenever we read something, suppose my idea of village is very different from another person's idea of village. For example, this is very true. Urbanites believe, people who live in urban areas, that they believe that villagers are very innocent. Village is a rosy picture of a hill and a rising or a setting sun and a small river flowing beside that, and then people are all living happily, etc. But look at, so that is the culture that they come from. But talk to a villager, he or she talks about extraordinary caste-driven society, poverty, absence of monsoon, agriculture being very difficult, and drought emptying the water resources. So an idea, a word like village brings in different imaginations and different meanings to different people based on the cultural competency, the cultural background that they come from. So when one reads history, that is why Kant is saying that when one reads history also, the understanding, whatever language that is used, understanding of that history is based on the reader's cultural background. So reading Indian history by a European is, he understands it very differently when the same Indian history is read by an Indian. Okay, so that is the cultural background. So deconstruction historian rejected the whole idea that language is strong enough to write history, language is strong enough to construct an unbiased, impartial historical knowledge. It is not possible. Deconstructionist historian said language is a social construct, and therefore understanding whatever is written in a language, understanding it is based on relative experiences. Okay, Derrida was the one, Jacques Derrida was the one, he said, in fact, he accused the historians and said that historians also know that language is a social construct, that it is not stable, it is very unstable, etc. But because they do not have any other way of studying the past, the historians constantly ignore this unstable character of language. So a historian knows that using language cannot really bring the past back in the way it has to be understood. Historian knows, but what is the other alternative? Nothing. And so Derrida said, just because someone said that using appropriate language to write about the past is a guaranteed way of getting the truth, just because someone believed in that, it does not mean it happens. So Derrida's argument was that there is no original meaning that can be uncovered. All historical texts are hermeneutically unrecoverable. So the challenge for historians is, how do we study the socio-economic history of the past through the annals period? Annals said, look at monastic records, look at oral narratives, look at the diaries or the biographies that people have written, and start writing history. And all of these are dominated by language. And deconstructionist historians are saying that language is a social construct, and hence it does not have a capacity to communicate any uniform or universal meaning. It is, on the contrary, it is understood based on the cultural background from which a reader is coming from. So, all of this deconstructionist argument has now led to my last brand, and that is the ideology of postmodernism. Now, what did the postmodernist argue? The postmodernist argument was that they said, Kate Jenkins was one of the earliest postmodernist historian. He argued that in his Rethinking History is the seminal book of Keith Jenkins. In that book, he says, forget about language. Okay, yes, language is a problem. It is very problematic, and it can be understood only on the basis of the reader's cultural competence. Fine. And the other problem is the past, when a historian reconstructs the past or constructs the past, a historian is not doing or not constructing the past in the same medium as it occurred. For example, how are we studying the past? How are we studying Kautilya's Arthashastra? Not in the language it was written. How are we studying Caesar's diaries, Julius Caesar's diaries? Not in Latin or Greek. We are studying them only in translated versions. Okay, how are we building up our image about the past? Through visual text, through films. We use a lot of films, a lot of sculpture, a lot of painting. So history is constantly brought back in very different medium, different from the way it had occurred. And so Jenkins argues that history is not about the past, but it is only writings about certain periods. We are not studying history about the past. It is primarily writings about the past which have a lot of problem because of language, because of the limited capacity of language. So Keith Jenkins' argument was that historical writings are not scientific, they are not objective, they are not really fixed, but they are free-floating textual writing. Okay, constantly we write in a comparative mode. So there is nothing original as a meaning. So the challenge for reconstructing socio-economic history, the challenge for constructing socio-economic history is primarily through these three ideas. And one is, Anna School argued that look at non-government resources. Look at what ordinary people have written about their everyday life and then start collecting historical source. At the moment the annals said that, deconstructionists said, how do we collect the past? Through language, and language is very, very unstable. Whatever is a meaning for a word now, today, changes after 30 years. Okay, the use also changes. At one point of time, Negro was a word that was used rampantly. But today we strongly protest the use of word Negro because it is abusive. It is considered as very insulting, very abusive. We call them as someone with darker complexion, we call them as Afro-American. So the meaning of the word constantly changes. How can historical knowledge be considered as truthful when history uses language like this to construct it? So the challenge is not in terms of what sources should we collect, where should we go and collect, okay, what are the categories of books, socioeconomic history books that exist. Challenge is not that. Challenge is much more fundamental, much more basic. Also, for the postmodernists, another big problem is that they say when past can be conquered or past can be brought in through the author, then the postmodernists have challenged this notion of the powerful authorial voice, as if whole past is shared only by the author and not by anybody else. So the burden of knowing the past, the burden of sharing the past is solely dependent on one single individual. So a whole Mauryan state so big, a whole Mughal state, or a whole colonial empire, the whole knowledge of that colonial empire is able to come to us only if one historian, right? So hundreds of years of lived in experiences are now based on just the shoulder of one historian. The postmodernists have constantly questioned or challenged the notion of this authorial voice. So these are the main challenges that come or that exist in understanding or in getting an idea of constructing the socio-economic history. So I concluded. I was given 1 hour. I started out at 10:40 and I'm